Assalamu alaikum. Hello. I'm here today to talk to you about why we are at a critical juncture in history. These are extraordinary times for Bangladesh, and I don't just mean in the context of all the political changes that we've been witnessing. What I hope to impress upon you today is that the time is now, and what we can do today together with CLP can change Bangladesh, can transform the future of this country, and dramatically alter the lives and the livelihoods of many millions of people. Now, in order for me to explain that to you, I need to go over some basic economics as it relates to Bangladesh. According to a Boston Consulting Group study, the middle income and affluent consumer class in Bangladesh is expanding rapidly, predicted to hit 17% of the country's population in 2025. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot, 17%. But 17% in Bangladesh is a staggering 31 million people. And that's more than the combined population of Austria, Switzerland, and Hungary combined. Hard to imagine back in 1971 when Bangladesh was dismissed as an international basket case by many. And that's not even the whole story. According to WealthX, which is a group that studies high net worth individuals, so people who have net assets of more than $5 million. According to WealthX, Bangladesh was the global leader in wealth growth from 2010 to 2019. So in those 10 years, the number of high net worth people in Bangladesh grew at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. And that is phenomenal. So well done, Bangladesh. A good pat on the back, right? Well, yes. But I would argue that that's not the whole story. Because you see, in Bangladesh, the wealthiest 10% of the population holds some 41% of the nation's wealth. Whereas the bottom 10% holds around 1% of the nation's wealth. Now, that's not completely unusual. These are standard growing pains in any fast developing economy. But how can we accelerate the trickle-down effect? Now, at this point, the socialists amongst you will get upset and say, oh, there's no such thing as a trickle-down effect. But in the case of Bangladesh, that is objectively false. Because you see, if you look at the garments industry alone, the garments industry, notwithstanding the fact that the owners of the garments industries have all become fabulously wealthy, no question. But the garments industry employs some 4 million people. Most of them women. And you cannot argue that that hasn't had a demographic effect, a social effect, an economic effect on the lives of many millions of people. So clearly there is a trickle-down effect. The question isn't if it exists. The question is, how do we get the majority of the population involved in a more substantial way in this growing economy? How do we accelerate this trickle-down effect? So let me show you what the GDP per capita growth in Bangladesh looks like. Because if you look at this slide and you compare Bangladesh to India, Pakistan, and Cambodia, it looks like we're doing very, very well. In fact, not only have we long left Pakistan in the dust, but we now have a higher GDP per capita even than India. Now, if you were to adjust to a PPP, a purchasing power parity basis, India might be slightly ahead of Bangladesh, but nonetheless, this growth has been phenomenal. And it tells a very, very good story, and we love to pat each other on the back looking at this. But there are some issues with this, and I'll come to that in a second. But let me show you another slide, because on this slide, I'm going to add Vietnam and Sri Lanka. And you see, when you look at it in this context, it is nowhere near where Bangladesh is, because Vietnam and Sri Lanka are way ahead of where Bangladesh is. And if you look at Vietnam in particular, in the 90s, its GDP per capita was well below that of Bangladesh. But look where it is now. So I would argue that instead of comparing ourselves to India and Pakistan and patting ourselves in the back, maybe lightly patting ourselves in the back, we should be looking at what is Vietnam doing that we're not? Why are they so far ahead of where we are when they used to be far behind? Now let's go back to analyzing the story behind this GDP growth in Bangladesh. Because clearly there has been growth, but I would argue that this graph is a bit misleading. Because a lot of the GDP growth in Bangladesh, certainly a decent chunk of it, has come from the real estate industry. And I would argue that the real estate industry, while absolutely being a contributor to the GDP, is not a very meaningful contributor. Because the real estate industry in Bangladesh is almost like a Ponzi scheme. It's the same people that keep investing over and over again into the real estate industry. It's not contributing to significant GDP growth that's benefiting the population at large. But if you look at the main GDP drivers that have really changed the country, there's really only two of them. Both of them are export oriented. The first one that we all know about, of course, is the garments industry. The garments industry in the 2021-2022 fiscal year brought in some almost 43 billion US dollars, 11% of the GDP. And there's a lot of positives about it, such as women's empowerment and all the things that we already discussed in terms of the social impact that it's having. But that garments industry carries with it some huge risks. First, industry as a whole is becoming more and more automated. And with the advent of artificial intelligence and improvements in robotics, more of the garments industry processes are becoming automated. And if that is the case, and the garments industries become completely automated, then where would I put my factories? Would I put them in Bangladesh? I would not put them in Bangladesh. I would put them in the locations that have the best infrastructure, the best power infrastructure, the best distribution networks, and the best support in terms of the logistics and infrastructure from all the services around it. And that is not Bangladesh. So that's a huge risk to Bangladesh. The second risk to that industry is that Bangladesh historically has enjoyed what we call LDC status, LDC being least developed country. Because if you are an LDC, then you have the advantage of enjoying tariff-free access to many Western markets. Now, ironically, as the economy in Bangladesh has improved and we've pushed towards leaving LDC status and becoming a developing economy, the problem is that we lose those tariff-free accesses. And when that happens, the cost advantage that we have enjoyed historically goes away. And again, at that point, the buyers will go to other suppliers outside of Bangladesh. So the garments industry, as you can see, is hanging on a thread. Pun intended, by the way. The second biggest contributor to the economy has been the overseas workers' remittances. The overseas workers that we have in many of the countries, such as the countries in the Middle East and Malaysia, they send home a lot of foreign exchange each year. And in the last fiscal year for which we have statistics, those remittances were some 22 billion US dollars. That's almost 7% of the GDP in that year. Now the problem with that industry is that it depends on employment in oil-rich countries, particularly in the Middle East. And so therefore Bangladesh indirectly has a lot of exposure to oil. And so that again is a singular point of failure. So if you look at these two industries that have fueled a large part of the growth, we're kind of in risky territory because both of these can go away very, very quickly. Clearly then, we need to diversify into other industries, especially high-value industries, like services, technology, software, those types of industries. But those are precisely the industries in which we have historically struggled to compete with other countries like India, Sri Lanka, other neighboring South Asian countries. Many of these industries require significant investment, but historically we have struggled to attract outside investment. You see, if you look at really successful economies that have grown extremely rapidly, like China, they did so largely driven by FDI, foreign direct investment. And if you look at China, what they did is they supercharged their growth through FDI, because FDI brings in US dollars. And with the US dollars, you can import machinery, you can import expertise that develops the manufacturing industries that you need to develop. Now, historically, if you look at why China succeeded, at the time when they brought in the FDI and started growing, most of that FDI went to China as opposed to other countries like India, because China had a higher level of basic education in its workforce, and it had much better infrastructure. And it had better infrastructure because China decided early on to invest heavily in their infrastructure. In fact, they encouraged the banks to offer favorable credit terms to anybody who was willing to work on infrastructure. And once China brought in the FDI, they were able to supercharge their growth process, develop all their industries. In fact, China itself has become such a mature economy now that their labor cost has gone up, and they in turn have now started exporting a lot of their manufacturing to other markets. Bangladesh should have been at the receiving end of that China relocation trade. But we got a tiny sliver of it. We got almost none of it. Most of it went to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and even Cambodia to some extent. And that's not even the only issue. If you look at industries like the tech industry, which is often driven by startups, right? The unicorns in the US, for example, are very, very famous for having grown exponentially. And if you look at what fuels the startups, it's generally venture capital. Venture capital invests early on to grow these startups, which then become successful companies. And if you look at venture capital that is attracted from the outside, so foreign venture capital that comes into countries, that's a very, very good metric for how the startup industry is developing within a country. And if you start looking at those numbers over the last 5 years, then in Indonesia, that number comes in at $34 a head per capita. We have to look at it per capita because if you look in absolute terms, obviously the Indian economy is much larger than the Bangladesh one, so you can't do a direct comparison. But we can do a comparison on a per capita basis. So in Indonesia, that number comes in at $34 a head. In India, over those 5 years, that number comes in at $30 a head. In Pakistan, that number is $1.60 for the last 5 years. And if you look at it in Bangladesh, over the last 5 years, depending on how you measure it, that number comes in at somewhere between 50 cents a head and $1 a head. So much, much lower than any of these other countries. And the question is why? Why is Bangladesh failing to attract this capital to develop its industries? Well, the reasons are complicated. There are multiple issues. Some of them are connected to each other. And the reason we're losing to places like Vietnam is a little bit different from why we lose to places like India and Pakistan. But let's start going through the reasons. When I first bring up these numbers, anybody I tell will immediately respond with, oh yeah, that's because of the corruption. Is it? Is it the corruption that is chasing away all the foreign investment into Bangladesh? Well, it's certainly not helping. And there are well-documented cases of foreign capital being chased away because of corruption, so that is absolutely a factor. But you see, if you look at Pakistan, it's bringing in 3 times as much VC per capita than Bangladesh, and you cannot argue to me that Pakistan is less corrupt than Bangladesh. So clearly there's something else going on here. So what else is going on? Well, let's get the easy stuff out of the way. First and foremost, there's a lot of red tape around the foreign investment process in Bangladesh. There are issues with how you bring in the foreign capital, there are issues with lockup period, there are complexities with how you withdraw the money if you invest as a foreign investor, these issues are chasing away a lot of foreign investors. And the ease of doing business in Bangladesh is quite poor compared to other countries. This is something that the government absolutely needs to look at and fix. Furthermore, what a lot of outside investors will tell you is that they're worried about downstream liquidity. And what they mean by that is that when they invest in a country like Bangladesh, they want to have an exit plan. So if the company does well, how do they get out? How do they sell their stake? How do they pull the money out? In Bangladesh, because we don't have mature capital markets, they can't just go and IPO it and sell it in the public markets, because the public markets really aren't set up in a very mature fashion. We have a lot of irregularities in the public markets in Bangladesh that scare away a lot of foreign investors. So that absolutely needs to be addressed. And that is also for the government to address and should be high on their priority list. But there are two more fundamental issues that have historically affected our ability to attract foreign capital into Bangladesh. And these issues are, first, our brand and our marketing. And the second is that our labor force lacks basic things like proficiency in English, basic skills in technology, and communication skills. What do I mean by our brand and marketing? Bangladesh does not have a positive image in much of the world. People don't think of Bangladesh as a probable investment destination because we just haven't advertised ourselves properly. And that issue is linked to the second issue. It may not be apparent that the lack of skills in the labor force is related to the brand and marketing, but they are. And allow me to explain how. You see, the labor force in Bangladesh lacks proficiency in English, even at the educated level. And this is because early on in the country's history, the decision was made to de-emphasize English from the educational curriculum. Now, I understand the patriotic reasons why this was done. I totally get it. My father was a Bhasha Shoinik. I get it. But West Bengalis are no less proud of their language than we are. And they've managed to maintain their proficiency in English while preserving their cultural heritage. We should have too. Because you see, that decision to de-emphasize English has come at an enormous cost that I can't even begin to stress enough. We've had generations of university graduates who cannot speak English fluently. And worse than that, we emphasize all the wrong things in our educational curriculum. It's all about rote memorization. What do we tell our kids? We tell them from the moment they're born to keep their heads down, to focus hard on their studies, to stay out of trouble, to not ask any questions, and for God's sake, don't even think about talking to anybody of the opposite gender. Now, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but the gist of it is true. We don't emphasize the right things. We emphasize book smarts. We emphasize being a really good student, which I don't mean to diminish the importance of that. But it is not the only thing that matters. Because you see, if you look around the world, who is running the world? Who are the leaders of countries, of the largest corporations? It's not the smartest kids in terms of book smarts. No. It's the people who know how to communicate. And we are not teaching our kids how to communicate because we are so obsessed with the book smarts and staying out of trouble and not asking questions. And so we are producing the wrong kinds of graduates. We're producing people who will make good soldiers in companies, who when told what to do will get it done. But we are not producing decision makers, entrepreneurs, people who are going to change the world. And so we are producing graduates who lack the language and the skills to communicate. And so when we send government delegations abroad to try and attract investors, we're sending the wrong message to the wrong people. I've been invited to many of these presentations from the delegations for whatever reason. I'm going to give you one example of when the BSEC came to the US on an investment roadshow, which in and of itself makes no sense because BSEC is a regulatory agency. It should never have been on a roadshow. Nonetheless, they went on a roadshow and they sent out flyers to prospective investors that they wanted to invite to these presentations. And the BSEC was visiting 4 different cities in the US. New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and I think San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. And on that flyer, of the 4 cities, 3 of them were misspelled. What message does that send to prospective investors when we can't even spell the name of their cities correctly? And then the presentations themselves were abysmal, poorly made, poorly presented, and awful language. And in contrast, when you look at the delegations that India and Pakistan is sending, they're sending people who speak like Shashi Tharoor, fluent English, polished, mature. It's night and day compared to what we're sending. And so you see the issue of language is critically important. And we have not focused on that at all in our educational curriculum. And we haven't taught the right skills to our kids. And that manifests itself in many, many different ways. Not only is our labor force not competitive, but we can't even project the right brand for Bangladesh on a global basis. And historically, there's been another problem. Because you see, if you look at capitalism, what is the promise of capitalism? The promise of capitalism is to bring capital to the best ideas and talent anywhere in the world. Does it work? Well, in the Western countries, by and large, yes. But you see, in developing countries like Bangladesh, it doesn't work so well because access to resources is not equal. Historically, education and resources have been limited to the privileged in Bangladesh. And the more privileged you are, the better your education and the better your access to resources. But the best innovations, the biggest growth drivers usually come from those with the biggest hunger. And those with the biggest hunger are not the people, generally, in the privileged classes. It's from the middle class and from the working class, from people who really want to improve their own trajectories. And when you go to Bangladesh and you see how hard people work and how eager they are to advance themselves, to seek knowledge, to make a difference, you have to marvel at the level of enterprise. And you have to wonder, what if these people had access to the same educational resources to which the privileged have access? They could change the world. And so it seems now at this point, when you look at it and you look at the status quo, it may seem like doom and gloom. But I have some good news. And here is the good news. What this slide shows you is the number of mobile subscribers per 100 people in all these countries. And I don't want to get bogged down here by who is higher than who, because what really matters is that the mobile subscription rate has been growing exponentially in all these markets. And in Bangladesh, for every 100 people, there are more than 100 mobile subscribers. And you may be scratching your head thinking, oh, how is it possible? Well, it's easily possible because in Bangladesh, having mobile phones is a status symbol. And anybody who's anybody has more than one phone, right? They all walk around with multiple phones like it's something very, very important to have. But the important thing here is that everyone has access to smartphones now, and therefore access to the internet and almost infinite resources as a result. And I can't begin to stress enough how monumental that is in changing the landscape. Because you see, what that means is that countries like Bangladesh have now leapfrogged over most of the traditional stages of development that all of the developed markets have had to go through. We don't have to wait for the entire country to be wired in order for people to be connected and have access to resources. Just like that, the entire country is now connected. And even the people in the most remote corners of Bangladesh have access now to this resource, have access to the internet. And you may think I'm exaggerating in how much of an impact this has had. But I'm not. Let me give you some examples. My late mother, may God bless her soul, my late mother bought herself a smartphone. And she bought herself a smartphone because she wanted to be able to communicate with her kids who were abroad. She wanted to be able to access Facebook and connect socially with all her relatives and friends. And she wanted to be able to access YouTube and watch her favorite dramas and all these things while she's on the go. And although my mother was fluent in English, she just couldn't figure out how to use the device and access the things she wanted to access. And all her kids were abroad, so we couldn't show her. So guess who showed her? The person who was able to teach my mom how to use her mobile phone was her household help. And this lady could not read or write in Bangla, let alone in English. Yet she knew how to operate the phone, how to access each app, how to call various people with the various apps that my mom had, how to set up Facebook, how to access the dramas on YouTube. She taught my mom all of this, and she didn't know how to read or write. Now imagine if she knew how to read and write and spoke English. Imagine what she could have achieved. In Bangladesh now, as you travel around, you will notice there are beggars on many of the key intersections. Those beggars all have mobile phones hidden underneath their clothes. And they have mobile phones because they're all part of a big mafia network that analyzes traffic patterns, that figures out which is the best place to place these beggars at what times to maximize their income. They were using data analysis long before it became in vogue for hedge funds to do so. That is the power of mobile technology. And if you talk to young people in Bangladesh now, they understand a reasonable amount of English. They know all the latest jargon and idioms, and they're familiar with all the latest trends and technologies. This is monumental. Because they know all this not because of the education system, but in spite of the education system. Where education before was expensive and impossible for the common person to access, everyone now has it at their fingertips. An entire generation now understands things that the previous generations did not. And so if we can enable the masses to access this, we can supercharge the educational process. We can sidestep it entirely and create a competitive labor force. Because if you talk to these kids now, and you ask them, what do you want to do in life? Where in the past, the mission was to land a stable government job and retire in that same job. Or to end up at a large corporation and end up in a job for life. These kids now, they want to be entrepreneurs. They want to create startups. They want to build technology. So if we could enable the masses to access these same resources, think about the potential. Because then we could not only bypass India and Pakistan and leave them in the dust, but we can overtake Vietnam and Sri Lanka. So how do we get there? What are we lacking? Well, because of the network now, they already have access to the internet. What they're lacking is the skills to understand how to access the resources they need. What they're lacking is the basic language skills, English specifically, to access all the resources on the internet, because the lingua franca of the internet has become English. And so English is the most common language for all these resources on the internet. So if they were armed with those skills and the English knowledge, then they could teach themselves. They could teach themselves things that before they could never hope to access ever. And now, if you arm them with that knowledge, and you teach them how to think critically, you teach them presentation skills, like how do you build a pitch book, how do you make a presentation to an investor, if you teach them basic communication skills, well then, we will have created a formidable workforce. A workforce that can take on any workforce anywhere in the world. So I hope what you will take away from this presentation, from this speech, is not that, hey, that was kind of interesting, and then forget about it. No, what I hope you take away is the realization that you are part of something that is truly transformational at this point. We are at an inflection point like none other. CLP has already laid out the basic framework. It has already laid out a basic network, the basic resources to build exactly what I've just described. All that's missing is funding to supercharge the process and reach every corner of the country and every individual of the country so that we really, truly can become the formidable economic force that Bangladesh has become. And what I hope you take away from this is that you are part of it. How much you are part of it is all a question of how much you put into it. So I humbly request you to join me in funding this initiative that I truly think will dramatically change Bangladesh forever. Thank you very much.